thank you all for coming, and may I also thank the Foreign Policy Association for having me. It's a real honor to address you all this evening. The theme of my talk, and it is a talk, not a lecture, and I encourage audience feedback and interaction. If anyone feels possessed to shout out their favorite aphorism, then I encourage you to do so at any time during the next hour or so. The theme is aphorisms and diplomacy, and I will get to that theme in a minute. But because aphorisms are not only the world's oldest form of literature, they are also the world's most intimate and personal form of literature, I would first like to say a little bit about how I discovered aphorisms, why I love aphorisms, why I'm obsessed by aphorisms, and that will segue neatly into how aphorisms are used and abused in the context of diplomacy. Now, I first discovered aphorisms when I was 8 years old, and in the most unlikely of places, the Reader's Digest magazine. Now, does anyone ever heard of the Reader's Digest magazine? So you all will know the famous quotable quotes page in Reader's Digest. And it is still there, and it is still filled with quotable quotes by quotable folks like Oprah Winfrey, various Hollywood celebrities, and occasionally even statesmen and diplomats and politicians. And when I was 8 years old, I found a back issue of Reader's Digest magazine lying on the bathroom floor, slightly damp and mildewy, and I picked it up and I turned by chance to the quotable quotes page. And from that moment on, I was hooked. There was something about aphorisms that just completely knocked my socks off. What I loved about them was the intensity of language, the way that the authors played with words and manipulated words and crafted words, and how such a wealth of meaning and a wealth of possibilities was crammed into such a tiny, tiny space. I thought it was just incredible. Another thing that really turned me on about aphorisms is that they're very, very funny. A lot of them are, in any case. And Dr. Phil McGraw, has anyone ever heard of Dr. Phil McGraw? He's in Reader's Digest a lot. And one of his stuck in my mind, I just read it recently. If you marry for money, you will earn every penny. Unfortunately, that does not apply to me, but it's a good example of the humor, the way that aphorisms mix humor with wisdom. So my love affair with aphorisms started when I was about 8. And then when I was a teenager, about 12, 13, I developed an urge to collect them. Now, if you want to collect aphorisms, you have two choices. You either have to be blessed with an impeccable memory, or you have to make some kind of record of the aphorisms. And I have not been blessed with an impeccable memory. So I had, as many teenagers do, my room was plastered with posters of rock stars. And what I did was, I took David Bowie, turned his face to the wall, and I started writing the aphorisms on the back. After David Bowie came George Harrison. After George Harrison, Pink Floyd. Soon I had a whole room filled with aphorism wallpaper. And the aphorisms that I've collected, and from that moment on I've been collecting aphorisms till this day and this book, they've become a sort of like a photographic album, a sort of collection of intellectual snapshots. And when I reread an aphorism that I first encountered earlier in my life, it brings back all the memories and associations I had with that particular saying when I first read it. For example, when I was 16, I started learning to play the violin, and at that time came across the saying by Samuel Butler, "Life is like playing a violin solo in public and learning the instrument as one goes along." That applies to a lot of situations I found in life. Another one that I remember from my teenage years was by Abraham Lincoln, and that is, "I have been often forced to my knees by the overwhelming conviction that there was no place else to go." So now I've been dealing with the aphorism addiction pretty successfully, and I maintain a kind of semblance of normal life. But it is a fact that once you're kind of clued into aphorisms, you begin to see them absolutely everywhere. And that's certainly true for me. And this is another wonderful thing about aphorisms, is that unfortunately, when I'm at a dinner party, someone asks me what I do for a living, I have to say I write books about aphorisms. And many people say, what's an aphorism? And it's this kind of strange word, and it's not a very familiar word to many people. But as soon as you explain what an aphorism is, they immediately come with their favorite aphorism. Everybody has a favorite aphorism. It's the refrain to a popular song. It's something that their grandmother said. It's something that their father always said. It's something they read in a greeting card. Wherever you look, ladies and gentlemen, when you walk out this door in 45 minutes, you will find aphorisms. Just a few examples from my recent daily life. I was in the train recently, and a teenager was walking down the corridor of the train, and he had long hair and a couple studs in various painful places. He looked like a real party animal. And he had a T-shirt on, and the saying on the shirt was, a weekend wasted is not a wasted weekend. Now, I hasten to add that that's not necessarily a sentiment that I endorse in any way, but it is a very, very good aphorism. I recently got an email from someone who heard me interviewed on the radio, and she said, my boss just said this, and I have to know if it's an aphorism. And so she wrote it, and it is, the saying was, I thought it over until I overthought it. And I wrote back and I said, yes, that is an aphorism, and your boss should be in my book. That's a great encapsulation of what happens when you think too long about something, and you then become unable to act on it. Another one, someone that I just met casually, and we got to talking about aphorisms, and she mentioned this one. She couldn't remember who had told it to her, but she said it was her favorite saying, words to live by. And it goes, if you're not living on the edge, you're taking up too much space. So these are the kinds of sayings that are all around you. And these are the kinds of sayings that, whether you consciously know it or not, you are living your life by. For example, my father was very fond of saying, little said, easily mended. And that's one way to handle problems and situations in your life. And it's something that's certainly that he applied in his life, but it's something that stuck in my mind, but not necessarily as a model to always follow. So, now, before I get to the aphorisms and diplomacy part, I am going to try and show you what an aphorism is. Now, this involves juggling, I'm afraid. And see, the thing about aphorisms is they're the shortest literary form on the planet, but I've found it impossible to come up with a very short definition of what an aphorism is. So, instead of that, I came up with Geary's 5 laws of the aphorism. And these are the 5 laws that a saying must obey to be considered an aphorism. Now, the observant among you will notice that I am holding 3 balls, not 5. That is because it is very, very hard to juggle 5 balls. And I can't do it. So you're going to have to willingly suspend your disbelief and imagine that I'm really juggling 5. Excuse me, but I have to take off my jacket for this. Usually the people in the front row are not seriously harmed during this segment of the show, but I mean, just if you're insured, I think everything will be fine. Take a little sip of water. Okay. The first law of the aphorism is it must be brief. Why? Because only a fool gives a speech in a burning house. It's okay, you can laugh. It won't distract me. The second law is it must be definitive. There's no ifs, ands. Don't laugh that hard, because that does distract me. No, just kidding. The second law is must be definitive. No ifs, ands, or buts. Aphorists tell it like it is, or at least how they think it is. Getting some. There's so many colors in the background. I'm losing the the balls in the light. So the second law is it must be definitive. Now, Samuel Johnson, a great dictionary maker, he said, patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel. That's a definitive statement. Now, note that I do not say that aphorisms must be true, as proven by another great dictionary maker, Ambrose Bierce, who begged to differ with Dr. Johnson. And he said, patriotism is the first refuge of a scoundrel. Now, the third law is it must be personal. This is the difference between an aphorism and a proverb. A proverb is an aphorism that's been used for so long that it's had the identity of the author worn away. Self-love is the beginning of a lifelong romance. That's got Oscar Wilde written all over it, and that's why it's an aphorism. Now, the fourth law is it must be philosophical. Love means never having to say you're sorry. Okay, we've all heard that. Well, in my experience, love means having to say you're sorry on a regular basis. But apart from that, a saying like that is just not philosophical. It doesn't make you think. It's not provocative in any way. It induces complacency. An aphorism shakes you up, makes you think. Now, the fifth law, this is why aphorisms are like jokes. They have punchlines. There's a moment when you get an aphorism, just like you get a joke. This is also why aphorisms are like juggling. An aphorism has a verbal or a psychological or a linguistic twist that lifts you up and drops you into a place where you least expect it to be. And that is why, ladies and gentlemen, this is the big finale now. The fifth law of the aphorism is it must have a twist. I got lucky that time, I can tell you. Those are the 5 laws of an aphorism. Now, aphorisms and diplomacy. Now, there are many, many aphorisms about diplomacy. I'm just going to start by reading a few so you can get a sense of what they're like. This one is by a man named Sir Henry Wotton, who was a 17th century English diplomat, and he has the unfortunate distinction of penning probably one of the most memorable definitions of an ambassador, and that is as follows: an ambassador, an honest man sent to lie abroad for the good of his country. Michel de Montaigne, a great French writer and aphorist. What a stupid nation we are. We are not content with letting the world know of our vices and follies by repute. We go to foreign nations in order to show them to them by our presence. Winston Churchill, great politician, great diplomat, great author. During times of war, when truth is so precious, it must be surrounded by a bodyguard of lies. Benjamin Disraeli, interesting, another great British politician, great author, and great diplomat. He has the most, if you ever receive a book, not mine, if you ever receive a book from someone that you're not very enthusiastic about reading, you can always use Disraeli's reply: "Thank you for the book. I shall waste no time in reading it." Disraeli said, "The palace is not safe if the cottage is not happy." This thing is a very profound political insight. Theodore Roosevelt, another great diplomat, great politician, and great author. He had lots of very inspirational aphorisms, as well as political ones. The most successful politician is he who says what everybody is thinking most often and in the loudest voice. I'm sure that doesn't apply to any of our current crop of politicians. Montesquieu, a great French political thinker who influenced the founding fathers of America to a large extent. Republics end through luxury, monarchies through poverty. Exactly. When you hear a good aphorism, you just say, yeah, right on. Alexis de Tocqueville, another great Frenchman who understood a little bit about America. The most dangerous time for a bad government is when it begins to reform. Pretty good, huh? So these are all examples of politicians, diplomats, who also were great aphorists. But I'm not going to talk about any of these people for the rest of my little lecture. And that is because of something Noel Latif said to me earlier this year when we first met. Noel is also a great aphorism collector, an aphorism lover. And when we met, I think it was in January, we were exchanging our favorites, as two collectors do when they meet. And he repeated to me a saying that he had heard, which has stuck with me ever since. And when I was thinking about what I should talk about this evening, it gave me the guidance that I needed. And the saying was, and I don't remember who said it, so maybe you can tell me afterwards, where you stand depends on where you sit. I think that's absolutely brilliant. And not only does it apply to diplomacy, governments, politicians sitting around a negotiating table, in fact it applies to the dining room table with families and the boardroom table with corporations. And in fact, it's a saying that applies at every level of relationships, whether it's interpersonal relationships between individuals, whether it's multinational relationships between or among corporations, whether it's international relationships among nations. Where you stand on an issue is determined to a very, very, very large extent by where you sit. And if you're sitting in the right place, you'll have a very different opinion of an issue than if you're sitting in the wrong place. So, inspired by that quote, I thought I would choose aphorists from the book to talk about who have absolutely nothing to do with diplomacy. Now that's a unique approach to a lecture about aphorisms in diplomacy. But I think these aphorists will speak to the issues that are raised in diplomacy very, very directly. Appropriately enough, I'd like to begin with a Spaniard. Since we're in the headquarters of Grupo Santander, it seemed appropriate to pick one of Spain's greatest aphorists. He was a Spanish Jesuit monk, lived in the 17th century, and his name is Balthazar Grasim. Now he was an unusual monk in that he had lots of worldly interests. But as was customary in his time, he was destined for the clergy from a very young age. So when he was 12, 13, 14, he was already studying on the fast track to become a priest. And he led, for his entire life, a very monastic existence. He lived in a monastery, he didn't have a job, he prayed, he worked in the garden like the monks did at that time. But he maintained his worldly interests. And for example, he was a book collector. And in fact, he was an author. And he wrote not quite novels, but sort of fictional stories that parodied some of his contemporaries, the politics, political affairs of his era. And unfortunately, he made the mistake of also parodying some of his fellow Jesuit monks in not very well disguised terms. Naturally, his superiors did not think very highly of that, and consequently he was disciplined. And he was disciplined by being sent on a bread and water fast. His pens and pencils and paper were taken away from him. His book collection was taken away from him. He also collected coins. That was taken away from him. And he was forbidden to write. Now, the book that he did write before the Prohibition is called The Art of Worldly Wisdom. And it's remarkable because he displays an enormous amount of worldly wisdom for someone who has so little worldly experience. I just want to give you a few examples of that wisdom. First of all, life is a warfare against the malice of others. Not a very likely thought coming out of the mouth of a Jesuit monk. Now, what's also interesting about Gracian is that he employed the long-form aphorism. So some aphorisms are very short, they're just a few words long. Some are several sentences long. And Gracian wrote ones that are several sentences long. But actually, even though it's a short paragraph, you'll notice when I read one, it's actually made up of individual aphorisms. So every line is an aphorism, and the whole thing together is an aphorism. Know how to use evasion. That is how smart people get out of difficulties. They extract themselves from the most intricate labyrinth by some witty application of a bright remark. They get out of a serious contention by an airy nothing or by raising a smile. Most of the great leaders are well grounded in this art. When you have to refuse something, often the most courteous way is to just change the subject. And sometimes it proves the highest understanding to act as if you do not understand. The greatest foresight consists in determining beforehand the time of trouble. It is better to sleep on things beforehand than lie awake about them afterwards. This is one of my favorites. Mix a little mystery with everything, and the very mystery arouses veneration. And when you explain, do not be too explicit, just as you do not expose your inmost thoughts in ordinary conversation. Cautious silence is the sacred sanctuary of worldly wisdom. A resolution declared is never highly thought of. It only leaves room for criticism. And if it happens to fail, you are doubly unfortunate. Besides, you imitate the divine way when you inspire people to wonder and watch. Reminds me of another Disraeli aphorism: never complain and never explain. Now, what's interesting, even more interesting about Gracian, is that he has a lot in common with someone who you would associate with diplomacy, but certainly not with monasteries, and that is Machiavelli. Machiavelli was also a very, very accomplished aphorist, and he applied his aphorist's art to winning favor and trying to get on the good side of whoever happened to be running Italy at the time. And I've done a little compare and contrast exercise with what the monk says and what the master of machinations, Machiavelli, says. Here's Gracian. Make people depend on you. It is not he that adorns, but he that adores that makes a divinity. The wise person would rather see others needing him than thanking him. To keep them on the threshold of hope is diplomatic. To trust their gratitude is boorish. Hope has a good memory, gratitude a bad one. More is to be got from dependence than from courtesy. He that has satisfied his thirst turns his back on the well, and the orange once squeezed falls from the golden platter into the wastebasket. Here's Machiavelli. A wise prince must devise ways by which his citizens are always and in all circumstances dependent on him and on his authority, and then they will always be faithful to him. Gracian, do pleasant things yourself, unpleasant things through others. Very good management technique. Machiavelli, princes should delegate to others the enactment of unpopular measures and keep in their own hands the means of winning favors. Gracian, push advantages, strike down your quarry. If you are wise, do not be content to merely flush it out. This is a monk speaking. Machiavelli, violence must be inflicted once and for all. People will then forget what it tastes like, and so be less resentful. Benefits must be conferred gradually, and in that way they will taste better. Now, there's another Italian who was a contemporary of Machiavelli's, Machiavelli has a reputation for being, how shall I put it, not a very nice person. He's always associated with do whatever it takes to get your way. But actually, if you read his book, The Prince is kind of ruthless in that sense. But he also wrote widely on the Republic as the ideal form of government. So he wasn't a complete jerk. Unlike Francesco Guicciardini, who was a complete jerk. And he was even more ruthless than Machiavelli, and even more sinister than Machiavelli, and advised, he also wrote a treatise for princes, in which he advised, his basic philosophy was, do whatever it takes to get what you want. Always deny what you don't want to be known, and always affirm what you want to be believed. For though there be much, even conclusive evidence to the contrary, a fervent affirmation or denial will often create at least some doubt in the mind of your listener. Pardon me? We had an editorial announcement here. Waste no time with revolutions that do not remove the causes of your complaints, but that simply change the faces of those in charge. Okay. So, now I'm only supposed to talk for 30 minutes because I hope you all have lots of questions and lots of aphorisms, and I hope I have a few answers as well. But I do want to give two more aphorists who have a lot to say about diplomacy, though you would never think it. If I can just find them. Okay. Nicolas Chaumont, 18th century French author. Now his biography could have come right out of a Charles Dickens novel. He was born to a woman of minor nobility in central France, and his father was not her husband. Now, that was not okay in the 18th century, and it was fine if you were a man to have illegitimate children, but not if you were a woman. So something had to be done about this child, Nicolas. Coincidentally, on the very day that he was born in this small village in central France, the son of the local grocer was also born, and he died in childbirth. So the mother delicately suggested a swap. The grocer took her son, the nobleman, and she took his son, who had died in childbirth. So for the first 8 years of his life, Nicolas Chaumont thought he was the son of a grocer. When he was 8, his mother appeared and told him his true lineage. Now, this sort of split personality that he had marked him for the rest of his life. He went on to become a very successful playwright. He was one of the toasts of the Parisian salons. He was in his early 20s, had written a very successful play. He was very successful with the ladies. He was smart. He was witty. He had everything going for him. And he was very, very keen to... Chaumont is his mother's husband's name. He was very keen to make it known that he was of noble birth. Until the French Revolution happened. And then his noble lineage came back to haunt him. And although he was one of the most outspoken proponents of the revolution, he was one of the first people through the gates of the Bastille as well. Because he was from noble lineage, he was immediately suspect. And he was arrested once and spent a couple days in a rat-infested prison. And he vowed that he would never let that happen again. So one night he was having dinner with some friends. The gendarmes knocked on the door. They came in. And he said, "Excuse me, I'm just having my soup course. Do you mind if I finish?" And being French, of course, they politely waited until he finished his soup. After his soup was finished, he withdrew to his study, presumably to collect his things, but actually he intended to commit suicide. He locked the door behind him, took out his revolver, and shot himself in the head. Unfortunately, he missed. And he blew out his eyeball, but otherwise was unharmed. So he took a knife and he slit his wrists. That didn't do the trick either, so he slit his wrists on the other side. That still didn't work. The man simply would not die, so he took the knife and plunged it into his chest. And still, he lived. He inflicted a total of 22 separate wounds on himself, and according to one eyewitness, blood was flowing out from under the door, and he survived. And he had a... But even after this tragic, totally self-inflicted experience, he retained his sense of humor. "What can you expect?" he said. "That's what it is to be clumsy with one's hands. One never managed to do anything successfully, even killing oneself." Now, He wrote many, many great aphorisms, none of which were known while he was alive. They were all discovered in a trunk after he died. He lived about 6 or 8 months after he tried to kill himself. And he's he's like an 18th century Andy Warhol, because what he writes about is celebrity and the influence of celebrity not only on politics but on the whole political culture that produces political leaders. I think what he has to say is very, very timely. Society is made up of 2 great classes, those who have more dinners than appetite, and those who have more appetite than dinners. Celebrity, the advantage of being known by those who do not know you. Some things can be more easily rendered legal than legitimate. Do you want to say something about that? A man must swallow a toad every morning if he wishes to be sure of finding nothing still more disgusting before the day is over. In a country where everyone is trying to be noticed, it is better to be bankrupt than to be nothing. Okay. Our last aphorist, Stanislav Lepek. He was a Polish aphorist. He died in 1967. And he, again, is someone who is almost completely unknown outside of Poland, but who speaks very, very much to, in my view, to our current times. And he also had a fascinating story. He was born in, as I said, in Poland, and he was a Jew. So during the Second World War, he was picked up by the Germans, and he was interred in a concentration camp. He escaped from that concentration camp by donning a stolen German uniform and walking right out the front gate. An absolutely amazing story. And he went on to join the resistance, first as a partisan, a fighter, and then as a sort of propagandist for the communist resistance. After the war was over, he was a member of the Communist Party, and he was rewarded for his services with a plum posting to Vienna as a cultural attaché. He became disillusioned with communism, but he never lost his skill as a maker of propaganda. So he continued to write and to publish. He was never silenced, he was never censored, because his aphorisms are so witty, and they're so clever, and they're so funny, that the censors had no idea that he was ridiculing the whole system. So during that whole period, he died in, like I said, in the late 60s, but from after the war until his death, he managed to continue publishing without interruption. And I think he's a very, very fitting aphorist with which to conclude. Tired rebels rest in the armchairs of power. The strongest brakes fail on the path of least resistance. That was a to-whom one. Those are the best. The mob shouts with one big mouth and eats with 1,000 little ones. The window on the world can be covered by a newspaper. That one means a lot to me as a journalist. No snowflake in an avalanche ever feels responsible. Here's the best definition of politics I've ever come across, and is also the shortest. Politics, a Trojan horse race. And I leave you with this. Another reason why aphorisms are where it's at. They're never, never dull. In the beginning was the word, at the end, just the cliche. Thank you very much for your attention.
Mr. Geary will answer some questions if you have some. Yes, sir.
In your research, do you find that there's any one area of the world where you find more of these people writing aphorisms than other parts?
No, aphorisms are universal.
Cultural issue.
Every culture has them. Every language has them. And in fact, each culture in each language has a sort of tradition that you can identify if you read enough of them. So, for example, when I said at the beginning, aphorisms are the oldest literary art form. They really are. The first written texts, Egyptian or ancient Egyptian or ancient Chinese, are collections of aphorisms. In the case of Egypt, it's often a sort of regional governor or some kind of minor potentate would write down a few sentences to pass on to his son as words of wisdom, and they're always called the wisdom of Ta-Hotep, or the wisdom of Joe Smith, or the wisdom of Mary Jones. And these are essentially little moral maxims that the Egyptian ruler wanted to pass on to his sons. In the case of China, and that's 5000 BC that we're talking, that these things were written. In the case of China, it's the I Ching, what's called here the Book of Changes, and that is essentially a collection of aphorisms, but sometimes they're very, very obscure aphorisms, and it's really unclear what the hell the author was talking about. But, for example, if you read Polish aphorisms, they're all, and also very interesting, something happening now, aphorisms from the Balkans. There's 4 Serbian aphorists in the book, whom I had specially translated for the book. And they're continuing the Polish tradition of very, very sarcastic and cynical political comment, like Stanislav's Jerzy Lech, and one that I can just think of. No, there's nothing worse than misquoting an aphorism, and I'm not remembering it. I'm not remembering it. That's terrible. I can look it up very quickly. But the Serbs have inherited that sort of cynicism and sarcasm about politics because they've lived under the same kind of regime as the. Yes, here it is. The distance from here to a brighter future can only be measured in light years. And that's by a guy named Rastko Zakic, who's from Belgrade. So if you look at Central and Eastern Europe, there's a long tradition of cynical political aphorisms. And American aphorisms, there's a great tradition, starting with Benjamin Franklin and Poor Richard's Almanac. Benjamin Franklin really started it all for American aphorisms, of very well-educated, highly cultured people adopting a down-home sort of country bumpkin persona in which to write their aphorisms. So Benjamin Franklin had Poor Richard. It is hard for an empty sack to stand upright. It's one of my favorites of his. Then you'd have Josh Billings, whose real name was Henry Wheeler Shaw, and he was the son of a Massachusetts state senator. But he called himself Josh Billings, and spelled. He was a pioneer of cacography, which I learned by researching this book is deliberately phonetically misspelling words. So he spelled aphorisms A-F-F-U-R-I-S-M. One of his he's also a sort of down-home philosopher, very funny, but also very inspirational. My favorite of his is, "Be like a postage stamp. Stick to one thing until you get there." So Josh Billings, he was a contemporary of Mark Twain. Then you have Mark Twain, and then you have another man who's been practically forgotten, Frank McKinney Hubbard, and he had a persona called Abe Martin, in which he was also a cartoonist, and he would draw cartoons and put his aphorisms in the mouth of Abe Martin. And one of his great aphorisms is, "The best way to double your money is to fold it over once and put it in your pocket." So there's a great tradition of humor in American aphorisms, and you can see if you read enough of one culture's aphorisms, you see it's a funny culture, or it's a political culture, or it's a depressive culture. I don't recommend Finnish aphorisms to anyone here.
Yes.
I heard Senator Casey from Pennsylvania make reference to his mentor. His mentor apparently said, "Never write a letter," or rather, what was it? Never write a letter unless it's absolutely necessary. Never destroy a letter. And I thought that was wonderful. And I went to Google, and I found out that fellow had not. You've never heard that before?
No, I've never heard that before.
Okay,
I like
went
it.
to Google and found out it was actually attributed to someone else by the name of Sir John Macdonald, who was a Canadian Prime Minister, and he apparently put together 6 minority governments in the late 19th century. So I mean, it was brilliant. So, but here was something that has sort of gone from being a quote that went into somebody else's domain, you didn't know where it came from, but ultimately you trace it back to John Macdonald.
Yes. Now, that is...
You laugh.
I think it's a great aphorism.
Yes, it's my favorite of the year. And I've never heard the term aphorism until a week ago.
See, that's exactly what I mean. But you've been living by aphorisms the whole time. So you know exactly what an aphorism is. So that's exactly what I'm talking about. Now, you've raised an issue that is really, really difficult for someone like me because it's attribution. And I've made mistakes in this book. And readers have been very quick and polite about it, but I've made mistakes. And there's a section on my website that to correct them. Because aphorisms are a kind of communal property. They have, unlike proverbs, they have an author. But once they get into the culture, they belong to everybody. And that's why, as an aphorism moves away from its original author, it gets someone says it in a speech, or someone says it in a conversation at the bar, and you mishear who said it, or you mishear who attributed it, and it ends up being attributed to someone who never said it. And I fell into that trap at least 4 times. So 4 out of 4,000. I'm not doing so bad yet, but the book's only been out a week, so. But it's very, very difficult to trace an aphorism back to its source. And what's very interesting is the process, at least interesting to an aphorism nerd like me, is the process by which an aphorism becomes a proverb. Because once no one really knows anymore who said something, then it stops being an aphorism and becomes a proverb. And does anyone know who wrote, "To err is human, to forgive divine"? Anybody want to take a guess?
Nixon.
That's right. It was Abraham Nixon. Anybody want to make a serious guess? Just take a shot. You look like it's on the tip of your tongue. Close. Alexander Pope. Now, I had no idea that Alexander Pope wrote that until I wrote my first book on the aphorism two years ago when I was researching it. I had no idea, and I am obsessed by aphorisms. So you can look at Alexander Pope's work, and you can see aphorisms becoming proverbs before your very eyes, because so few people still know that he was the author of that original saying. And as soon as no one is left who knows that, it'll be a proverb, until someone goes and writes another book about aphorisms and rediscovers it. So attribution is crucial.
Yes, sir.
I wrote an aphorism.
I know you did.
There is no rehab for oil addiction.
Ooh. Did you just write that now?
Yeah, I just wrote it now. The other one was, the tip of the iceberg is all that's left.
Oh! Excellent.
Thanks for the inspiration.
Thank you for the inspiration.
I got lost in it. One more?
One more.
Marriage counselors believe that World War II was the fault of both sides.
Very good.
No.
American presidents, any stand out as great aphorists?
Yes. Abraham Lincoln has to be one of the best. And he's the one... Now, Abraham Lincoln is a good example of the difficulty of attribution, because he said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." He did say that, but someone said it before him. And in fact, Mark, I think it was Mark, in the Gospel of Mark, said something, not exactly that, but something about a house divided against itself not being able to stand. So, when someone what actually happens, and Benjamin Franklin is another good example of this, is that as aphorisms get passed on from generation to generation, aphorists deliberately, or sometimes unconsciously, take the aphorism and change it. And in the case of Benjamin Franklin, he often improved. He stole from John Donne, he stole from Alexander Pope, because he was one of the few Americans at that time who had read these people, so no one could catch him. But when he stole those aphorisms, he gave it a little twist, and he often improved them. Abraham Lincoln was inspired by the Gospel of Mark, I think it was, for the saying, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." And in the context of that address in which it occurred, it is one of the most powerful aphorisms, and has gained a rightful place in American culture as one of the great sayings of an American president. So Abraham Lincoln earned the authorship of that, even though he was not the first author. He gave it his own identity. So I think Abraham Lincoln is definitely one of the all-time greats. I'll just quickly, he's in the book, coincidentally. Be sure you put your feet in the right place, then stand firm. This is one of my all-time favorites. Give me 6 hours to chop down a tree, and I will spend the first 4 sharpening the axe. This is also great. The best way to get a bad law repealed is to enforce it strictly. I think my personal favorite is definitely Abraham Lincoln. A close runner-up is Theodore Roosevelt. Now, the Roosevelts are interesting because there you see a family of aphorists, essentially, because you have Teddy Roosevelt, who was a great aphorist, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a great aphorist, and Eleanor Roosevelt was a reasonably good aphorist, although there's questions about some of her most famous sayings, whether she actually was the one who said those. And there are only very, very few instances in which you can see aphorisms, a talent for aphorisms being inherited through a family. And Teddy Roosevelt is remarkable in that very few of his aphorisms are actually about politics. He would have been a great Dr. Phil if he were alive today, because he had a way of expressing himself in very plain language, but very powerful language and inspirational language. Let me just give you an example here. And funny, too. If you could kick the person in the pants responsible for most of your trouble, you wouldn't sit for a month. I think there is only one quality worse than hardness of heart, and that is softness of head. Nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. Pray not for lighter burdens, but for stronger backs. So, my book, Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt.
Yes, this lady right here.
About translating aphorisms and transferring them from one culture to another, since so many of them are very closely related to a certain folk wisdom. Have you come across problems of translation or
yes.
struggling with?
Where are you from?
Repeat the question, I don't think.
German.
Okay.
There was a famous aphorist, 18th century aphorist, Lichtenberg.
Oh. Let's have a few, shall we? Where is he? Just to answer your question first, forgive me while I consult the index. I'm not sure what page he's on. It is translating aphorisms, and in the preparation of this book, I commissioned about a dozen people to translate aphorisms for me. So some of the aphorisms that are in here appear in English for the very first time. And I did a lot of research. I live in London, and I spent a lot of time in the British Library looking through books of aphorisms. And whenever I found one that was in a language I couldn't read, which was most of them, I would compile a list, and then I contacted people who were proficient in various languages: Russian, Finnish, Chinese, Japanese, Polish, French, Spanish, Italian, German. And I asked them to translate a few, and I would select what I thought were the best, and then they would translate some more. And sometimes, I have to say, it just didn't work. It's like translating a poem. Sometimes, if there's a pun that works in German, that just doesn't work in English, you can't translate the aphorism. And often there's a kind of sentiment, and especially it was interesting. It was very apparent in the translation from Chinese and Japanese that I just didn't get it. You know, the aphorism was correctly translated, but it didn't have the resonance from, yeah, exactly, it didn't have the punch. And so that may be a great aphorism in Chinese or Japanese, but it didn't make any sense in English. So it's a very difficult art translating aphorisms. And you mentioned Lichtenberg, who's one of the all-time greats. Just a couple by him. Georg Lichtenberg was actually a contemporary of Benjamin Franklin. He was also an almanac maker, like Benjamin Franklin. He also experimented with electricity, like Benjamin Franklin. And he was also a sort of minor inventor, like Benjamin Franklin. And he was also very, very, very funny, like Benjamin Franklin. It is impossible to carry the torch of truth through a crowd without singeing someone's beard. Speaking of diplomacy, there would be far less soothsaying if there were far more truth-saying. We say that someone occupies an official position, whereas it is the official position that occupies him. And this one. The most dangerous untruths are truths slightly distorted.
One more question? Yes, sir. Would you take the microphone, please?
Oh, I wonder if there's an aphoristic source for the phrase mending fences, which I often hear people use to signify reconciliation. On the face of it, it seems to mean just the opposite. And I wonder if they're misunderstanding Frost's phrase, good fences make good neighbors, or whether there's any, whether you know where that might come from, mending fences.
Yeah, now that is, there's also, just off the top of my head, there's another great aphorism. You mentioned Frost, by a Muslim aphorist whose name I can't remember, but it goes, everything requires a fence, which is very similar to Robert Frost's aphorism. As for mending fences, that's a classic example of a proverb, which at one time, so mending fences is essentially, what does that mean? You say, we have to mend fences. If you think about it literally, you think, what are you talking about? I'm not really good with my hands. Why don't you get a carpenter to do it? But mending fences is essentially a metaphor applied to human relations. And at one point, someone thought of that as an image for reconciliation. And I don't think it's the way I read it, it's not a misunderstanding, because obviously the fence was broken, and if you want to mend it, it's a recognition that something has to be done. So it's a sort of gesture towards reconciliation. So at one point in time, someone, who knows, made the link between the actual fact of mending a fence and that metaphorical reality of repairing a relationship with someone. And when that person first said that remark, it was an aphorism, and a really good one too. But it was so good, in fact, and became so popular and got passed around so much. It's like in certain Buddhist religions, as the worshippers go through a temple, there would be a statue of the Buddha there, and it's sort of considered a blessing to actually rub the statue as you pass very gently with your thumb. Now, some of these statues have been there for 1,000 years, and people have been rubbing them for 1,000 years. And if you look at that statue, you see it's been eroded. You can see it on steps in castles and stuff, where you see it goes like, the step goes like that, and then it goes like that, where everybody has been putting their foot. It's just like that with the statues, that as everyone through the centuries rubs their thumb across the Buddha's stomach, he gets a very shiny stomach, and a little bit is rubbed away each time. And that's what happens with an aphorism as it becomes a proverb. And mending fences, let sleeping dogs lie. It's a great, if you think about it, and it's also related to cliche, because these things are so well known. If you were to write, as a journalist, if I got an article and it said France was mending fences with the United States, I'd scratch it out, because it's a cliche. But originally, it was absolutely brilliant. And if you can think in your mind back to the time when that image was first invented, it is a really brilliant image, a brilliant way to metaphorically encapsulate human relations.
Just to be clear, it seems to me mending bridges bespeaks reconciliation.
Yeah.
Mending fences.
Well, no, because you want to help your neighbor to keep your cattle in on his cattle.
Oh, okay.
I mean, it's very important to
That's
keep
the
good
context.
fence. Sure.
Yeah. But I can see where you're coming from with your reading as well, and which is why aphorisms are such a great source of conversation and disagreement. Which is why diplomacy is so urgently needed.
Well, thank you so much. I think we've all had a lot of fun and learned a lot of things that we didn't know before. And we have a little reception upstairs, which you're all invited to join. And you can get Mr. Geary's book up there also. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Managed to put diplomacy in the last sentence.